It's OTA day. Second Hitter kicks off the notes by noting their primary purpose this week is weakening the Thanos and discard decks that have been dominating the meta for the last couple of weeks. Let's go ahead and dive on in and discuss how they're approaching this. The first change to cards in the Thanos deck is the Mindstone going from a 1/1 up to a 2/1 while retaining the on reveal of drawing 2 1-cost cards from your deck. Second Hitter kicks off their justification for this change by acknowledging that Thanos has become a bit of a problem for the metagame. They note that when they adjusted Timestone previously, they mentioned that Thanos can be constraining from a design perspective, specifically that the versatility of the stones allow the deck to maneuver and adapt to whatever the meta game becomes because of all the various utility that they provide. In all cases, however, they said that the Mindstone has consistently been the strongest of the stones, and they considered removing the second draw from it altogether, but ultimately they wanted to keep that part of the card, so they're electing instead to increase its cost. I think this change makes a lot of sense to me. I think the openings that the Thanos deck has, where it gets to play Mindstone on the first turn of the game, are definitely the strongest that the deck has available to it. And increasing it from 1 cost to 2 is a really meaningful difference. It's the difference between being able to play Mindstone on the first turn and then fill your curve on the second turn with the 2 stones that you draw, and having to deploy your Mindstone on the second turn and then needing to weave your other stones that you draw from it into your subsequent turns of the game, when really you would rather be able to play out other things like 3, 4, and 5 energy cards. It's also worth acknowledging that Mindstone going up to 2 energy means that it is now a stone that no longer enables you to play out Cull Obsidian, which is going to choke the deck on options with that new powerful 4/10 and make it so they have to spend even more energy after they play the Mindstone to get that 4/10 down into play. Second Hitter closes out the section talking about Mindstone by acknowledging they don't think this single change is likely to fully solve the Thanos problem, but they also hope it meaningfully addresses the archetype while they stew on a wider range of solutions for the long term. Our second change this week is another one to a card that's played in all of the best Thanos shells, and that is Psylock is going from a 2/2 back down to a 2/1, where she had originally started while still providing +1 energy on the following turn. Second Hitter justifies this change by noting that in recent months, Psylock's use has become restricted to almost exclusively Thanos, and its performance inside of Thanos is among the strongest cards in the deck. They're looking to take some points away from Thanos in the current metagame, and that makes reverting Psylock back to a 2/1 a logical step. I think this change makes a lot of sense, and I think taking a point of power off of Psylocke is actually a pretty meaningful swap, in large part due to the fact that one of the cards Psylocke is accelerating into quite frequently is Professor X, so taking a point of power away from her makes it easier for people playing into Thanos to contest an early Professor X coming down, with Psylocke providing less points of power. Our third nerf this week is targeted at the other powerful deck in the format, Discard, with Apocalypse going from a base 6/8 to a base 6/6, while retaining his ability when this is discarded, put it back in your hand with +4 power. Second Hitter starts by talking about how Discard has moved from the middle of the pack to the top of the metagame over the last month with the new additions of Corvus and Proxima Midnight to their arsenal. They go on to say that they want Discard to be a great deck, but their metrics indicate it's a hair too strong in its current state. Apocalypse, by the stats, is the single best performing card in the dedicated Discard archetype, so I wanted to take away a little bit of its base power to hopefully bring the deck as a whole in line with other things in the metagame. I think this change makes a reasonable amount of sense. Apocalypse is not only strong, but I think it's also one of the most difficult to interact with bits of the discard deck, whether you're playing the Apocalypse out on the last turn of the game and you have to jockey for priority correctly with Shang-Chi or Alioth, or that Apocalypse is going to get discarded and get it even larger to a Dracula, who's a little bit out of touch until Red Guardian at least releases next month. I think changing Apocalypse gives decks that are looking to just make big numbers to race the discard decks a more reasonable way to do that by making them need 2 less points of power to keep up with the output range the discard deck has. Moving from nerfs to buffs, we start with a change back that myself and many others have advocated for a little bit now. Captain Marvel is going from a 4/4 back up to a 4/5, while retaining the text box at the end of the game moves to a location that wins you the game, if possible. Second Inner kicks off their justification for this change back by acknowledging that Captain Marvel as a 4/5 was one of the strongest cards last year when they made this change. That being said, they also acknowledge that the metagame in Marvel Snap has changed since then, and a number of cards in the supporting cast when Captain Marvel was dominant have changed since then. They also note that 4/4 Captain Marvel hasn't seen the level of play that they'd like, so they'd like to see if the new metagame can tolerate the stronger Captain Marvel, and they love to give a buff to this iconic and exciting character. Honestly, no real additional notes on my end about that. I think I agree with all of that assessment, and I am also excited to see her get a buff. I've got a sweet Captain Marvel variant I would love to play with some more. Our next buff is a minor one, with Adam Warlock going from a 5/4 up to a 5/5 while retaining his text. After each turn, draw a card if you are winning here. They note that, as previously discussed, they made their initial Adam Warlock change with an abundance of caution. Since that change, they've seen improvement overall for the cards, but they feel like they can push it a little bit more. They also note that they think they could probably go as high as making Adam Warlock a 5/6 and still have it be a card that's not too pushed. But one of the archetypes specifically that they're hoping to improve by making Adam Warlock a 5/5 is the Cerebro 5 archetype, which could often be a difficult deck for them to get new cards into. So they're trying a slightly smaller buff for Adam in the short term, at least, to see if his stat line at 5 power can be a meaningful addition to that deck. All in all, I think making one of my favorite Cerebro decks better is a noble goal, and it's neat to see that Second Dinner is thinking about how their up and down changes potentially impact this in the metagame. Adam Warlock as a 5/4 didn't fit into Cerebro 4 because other cards like Sarah really competed for that 5 energy slot, and I could realistically see Adam Warlock as a 5/5 being a decent card inside of Cerebro 5, especially because that archetype already wants to play Wave quite frequently, which could accelerate Adam out on turn 4, turning into multiple draws over the course of the game for that deck. Our final change this week is actually a group of changes to all of the Guardians of the Galaxy. The first thing Second Dinner is doing is they're making uniform the bonus that the Guardians of the Galaxy get when you hit with their guess where your opponent played a card ability. Every single Guardian of the Galaxy will now get +4 when you guess right with that trigger. That being said, they're adjusting the stat lines on the Guardian, so the 4 cheapest Guardians all get an increase in total power when you guess correctly. Rocket Raccoon will now be a base 1/1, which means he gets up to a 1/5 when he hits with his +4. Star-Lord will remain a 2/2, but he's now going to get up to 2/6 when you guess correctly with his +4. Groot is going down to a 3/3, but will now go up to a 3/7 when you guess correctly with his +4. Drax is going down to a base 4/5, which means he'll now get up to 4/9 when you guess correctly with his +4. Gamora is technically getting a decrease in the amount of bonus power that she gets, going down to +4 from +5, but her base power is being increased to 5/8, so her total stats when she lands correctly will remain at a 5/12. Overall, I think this is a solid set of changes. Rocket Raccoon and Star-Lord in particular, I think, are cards that will now have stat lines that make them meaningfully worth potentially playing even in endgame situations. With cards like Titania and Martyr and the recently changed Ant-Man, we've seen that 5 points of power on a 1 energy card is kind of the tipping point where those cards start to become really playable. And I could see Rocket Raccoon being enjoyed inside of decks that have room to fit a 1 energy play into their later turns of the game when you have more information about where your opponent is likely to play out, making you more likely to trigger his ability. I think it's also worth noting that Rocket Raccoon's move down to 1 base power with this bigger bonus when you hit with its trigger also makes him perform better with one of my favorite cards, Bast, meaning perhaps Rocket Raccoon is an excellent candidate to be playing in a bounce deck moving forward. Overall, I'm not sure that I expect Groot or Drax to be particularly stellar, since their more expensive cost makes it a little bit harder to line up and guess their bonus correctly in the mid to late game, but they're not worse than they were before, I don't think. And finally, Gamora staying as effectively a 512, I think makes a lot of sense. I think she was the most playable of the Guardians before this round of changes, and she probably doesn't need additional points of power overall in the grand scheme of things. Overall, solid OTA this week. I'm really glad to see them not only address the Thanos and discard decks by taking some off the top, but I'm also really happy they decided to try and address Thanos by specifically targeting cards that are key to just the Thanos deck and not going after things like Cull Obsidian Mockingbird, which, while powerful inside of Thanos, see play in a variety of other decks where they have very reasonable stats not deserving of nerfs. They also gave us a handful of buffs that make sense, and I'm excited to play with not only Captain Marvel, but also the new Rocket Raccoon as someone who enjoys cheap cards with big stat lines. As always, I'd love to hear in the comments down below which changes you are excited to play with after this over-the-air update, which is live now. And if you enjoyed my musing on that topic, be sure to snap that like button, and hopefully we'll see you back again real soon for some more Snap content here on YouTube.